Railway guard Joe finishes his shift at London Station. He is denied a request for a promotion and is upset by the failure. Suddenly, the senior duty officer reports that one of the controllers is sick and Joe is sent on his shift. Joe doesn't want to leave into the night, but his favorite drink saleswoman Helen is working on this shift. Joe enters the train and begins his duties checking tickets. The shift begins with troubles with passengers. Unexpectedly, he meets Helen. She refuses the offer to meet after the shift. Then the guy finally checks everyone and can rest. Joe sits by the window and looks at the full moon. Suddenly, the brakes are applied and the train makes an emergency stop in a deep forest. Joe rushes to the head of the train, but the speakerphone turns on and the driver reports that the train has collided with something and he will now find out what is happening. Everyone is asked to stay in their places. At this time, the driver walks around the train but cannot understand what happened. Passengers begin to complain to Joe because the final station is quite far away and no one wants to hang around in the forest. The guy calms people down and tries to contact the driver, but he does not answer the call. Just at this moment, the man discovers a deer stuck under the wheels. He tries to remove the animal, and at that moment, the monster attacks him. People on the train begin to get nervous, as if they feel that something terrible has happened. Joe and Helen rush to the driver's cab, but there is no one inside. The employee does not answer calls and no one can explain to passengers what is happening. Joe tries to see what's going on outside, but it's too dark. Then the guy calls the dispatcher and reports the current situation, but he cannot help. Due to the recent storm, trees have fallen, damaging communications, and rescuers will be able to reach the train in no earlier than 4 hours. Hearing this, the passengers become furious because no one wants to hang out in the night forest all night. Joe admits that contact with the driver has also been lost. Kate declares that she will find the driver herself and find out when he intends to deliver them to their place. The screams are stopped by one of the passengers named Adrian. He suggests that those who do not want to wait should walk through the forest to the station, just 3 miles. In addition, they may be able to pick up a signal and call for help. Joe tries to persuade everyone to stay because this is a violation of the rules, and he could be fired if something happens to the passengers. He even refuses to open the doors, but after some time gives in and jumps out first. Joe lines up those who want to walk in a row and asks them not to disperse from each other. Adrian helps the weak go down and supports Helen. Suddenly, there is a noise in the bushes ahead. People say they think it is an animal or a returning driver. Joe goes ahead to find out. Helen catches up with the guy because she is also a railway worker. They walk a few meters and find the driver's body, after which they rush back to the train. However, the beast, which turns out to be a werewolf, pursues them. Passengers manage to run to the carriage and get into it, but then Joe notices that the older people have fallen behind. He asks them to hurry up. The man climbs into a carriage, but his wife is bitten on the leg by a werewolf. People close the doors and drag the victim away from the entrance. The women help her, while the men try to see what is going on outside. But in the darkness, nothing is visible, and people can hear the sounds of claws scratching the carriage and a terrible howl. The survivors are trying to comprehend what happened and somehow calm down. Joe gets to the driver's cab and again tries to call for help, but there is silence in response. Billy, an engineering student, determines that the fuel line on the train is damaged, and if the leak is not repaired, it will be impossible to move on. Joe announces this to the passengers, but people do not want to wait in the train, and besides, Jenny needs medical attention. The woman comes to her senses and says that she had been attacked by a creature, but he looked like a person. Passengers understand that this is nonsense, but then everyone hears sounds inside the next carriage. Joe, Billy, and Adrian follow the sound and see the door of a broken toilet twitching. From there comes a passenger who did not read the malfunction warning and got stuck there. The guy comes to his senses but cannot believe what happened, especially since they had already passed his station. Over time, Jenny gets worse, her temperature rises, and her leg swells. Passengers try to cheer each other up, but when everyone calms down, there is a knock on the carriage door. Then it becomes clear that the werewolf is already on the roof. Suddenly, the girl's phone starts ringing. She tries to call for help and goes to the window, but strong paws come out of the glass and grab the girl. The men are trying to hold her back. People run into the next carriage. The screams are stopped by an elderly gentleman who asks them to think about what they can do. Passengers are barricaded in the carriage. People can only wait for the morning, and Jenny is getting worse. Adrian admits to Joe that everything is fine in his life. When the beast breaks in, the man will need to sacrifice the weak in order to survive. His plan is interrupted by Jenny, who begins to vomit. The remaining teeth fall out of her mouth, and people don't know what to do. Joe notices that the passenger who was previously stuck in the toilet is missing. He goes to the next carriage and again finds it there, but the doors do not open. Joe hears screams and sees claw cuts on the door. He realizes that the werewolf is already inside the carriage and runs to the remaining passengers. Adrian tries to close the bars in front of him, but the women do not allow him to do this, and Joe manages to return to the carriage. The werewolf continues to break through the passenger barricades, but people help each other. When a monster breaks into them, they pounce on it and hit it with everything they can get their hands on. The guy who found the fire hatchet finishes off the werewolf. People look at the monster. He has a wedding ring on his hand, which means that he was once human. Adrian recalls a story from these places. 60 years ago, a train derailed. When help arrived, there was no one to save. Only scraps of clothing were lying around. Nobody knew the truth then. At this moment, the monster suddenly lets out a howl, and Adrian finishes it off with a fire extinguisher. But then sounds come from Jenny's place, and people notice changes in her appearance. It becomes clear that the woman is mutating. Adrian tries to kill Jenny, but her husband and the other passengers prevent him from doing so. Joe stuns the man with a blow to the head and asks to tie him and Jenny up. After this, Billy begins to repair the train. He shows Joe and Helen how everything is working and then goes outside to the fuel line. The guy with a hatchet accompanies him. Billy finds the place where the train is broken. At this time, Helen talks about the heroic actions of Joe, but she will not go out with him. Billy wraps the fuel line with electrical tape, and his partner suddenly hears the voice of the missing girl from the bushes. He searches for her, but sees only the remains, which are devoured by another werewolf. The guy runs towards the train, but he is surrounded by a whole group of monsters. The survivors hear the screams and understand that it is too early to relax. Jenny begins to transform. Adrian asks to untie him before it's too late. At this moment, the fuel line turns on. Joe and his friend are happy and do the necessary actions that Billy taught them. At this time, the guy sees a werewolf approaching. Helen turns on the lever and the train begins to move. At this point, Janie finally mutates, breaks out, and attacks the passengers. Kate frees Adrian. The man tries to escape from the monster and opens the doors and throws her out. Jenny turns into a full-fledged werewolf and attacks her husband. Adrian tries to fight her off. Billy, who is under the train, breaks the fuel line, and the train stops again. Joe and Helen run into the carriage, where they manage to destroy Jenny before she kills Adrian. Unfortunately, other werewolves manage to get on the train. Adrian lures Joe and Helen into a trap to cover his escape. He jumps out and leaves the couple in the train with the monsters. Suddenly, Billy returns to the carriage and tries to fight off the werewolves. He kills several of the creatures and orders Joe and Helen to escape, but he himself dies heroically. The couple runs into the forest and is chased by a pack of monsters. Joe realizes that they will not escape and stays to fight them. The girl continues to run. Joe fights bravely, but in the end, he gets bitten by the werewolf, after which he himself becomes a monster. Meanwhile, Helen arrives safely at the nearest station. At this time, Adrian wanders through the forest and suddenly encounters a pack of werewolves, after which Joe attacks him.